So welcome to this Proservartner podcast, part of our ongoing series talking outsourcing. My name is Paul Morrison. I'm Managing Director at Advisors Proservartner and delighted again to be joined by Rakesh, our CEO.
Please. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Welcome, Rakesh. And today's topic is on how to run a successful BPO transition. And in our previous podcast, we were talking about how to work through an RFP tender process to select your BPO provider. This is really all around what happens next. How do you go from in-house delivery to an outsourced steady state? How do you transition without all of your key knowledge disappearing, evaporating as soon as the outsourcing is announced? How do you cut over without a massive loss of quality? And how do you do the transition without it taking forever or costing the earth? So there's lots that needs to go right for that transition to be seamless and successful. And we've distilled a few of our top tips. We've got 9 top tips on what to think about in that smooth BPO transition. So we'll jump straight in with number 1. Over to you, Rakesh.
Yeah, I guess the first one for me would be around no surprises. And I think this is beneficial for both the BPO provider and the buyer of those services, because what's really important is you reduce the ambiguity by thinking about transition a lot earlier than after you've signed the contract. I think you need to make sure that you thought about transition throughout the RFP process as you get into contracting. So you're really clear on the scope. You've done your due diligence. You understand what the BPO is going to be strong in, weak in. You understand also your strengths and weaknesses as you go through this. And so I think having no surprises, having a very transparent, trust-fueled relationship is probably my tip number 1, because I think that foundation is the great way to start.
Super. Number 1. So on to number 2 then is all around the right team, the right skills on the bus, as it were. And I think that's something that applies both to the team from the client side and the supplier side. As Rakesh says there about getting things lined up well in advance of transition through that contracting phase and the sales phase. You as a buyer will be exposed to the proposed transition team, and you will be selecting your winning provider with that in mind, and that team will be coming into place. At the same time, you need to be positioning on your side the lead resources who are going to take the transition forward, and some of those may be obvious roles who are perhaps process leads, but who is going to guide and steer the transition from your side. Even though typically the lead for the transition is guided by the supplier, who is going to be the counterpart on your side. So that needs to be really tightly thought through, and those leads need to be dedicated as well. They need to be really focused on this with appropriate backfill to enable them to focus on the role.
Yeah, I think number 3, good points, Paul. I think number 3 for me would be around a strong methodology. So, making sure that you've got a clear view around your train-the-trainer approach, what toll gates you'll be following, having some contingency built into your transition approach, how you're assessing, the complexity of the processes, and then finally, how you're managing the change process. Because I think when you're running the transition, what you find is that your project team on the ground working with the people being impacted are really the face of the change. So they need to be singing from the same hymn sheet as the rest of the program, sending the right key messages. So having that strong methodology in place so that the team and the people impacted are well prepared and it's planned and it's organized, I think makes a great difference. And I've seen places, I remember in my Accenture days, we turned up with a team.
That's a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, yeah. We turned up with a team looking to take over these processes. and the communication went out the day before we arrived. So yeah, I think a poor methodology can mean that you do these things too late, you don't follow a structured approach, and then you're not training enough people. A big question is around what percentage of your staff do you have as train the trainer versus are trained directly by the SMEs. How do you use the feedback that the impacted staff are giving around the new team that are going to be taking over? I think things like that, the little mini improvements and the mini areas of feedback make a huge difference in the success of these types of programs.
Big questions indeed. So number 4 then is around having a realistic plan, an achievable plan, and the right sequencing. So building on the right methodology, has that been translated and set out in a way that is achievable? Now, the strong business cases of BPOs is all around getting to benefits as quickly as possible. So delay is to be minimized. At the same time, you've got to enable the teams to be able to get up the learning curve in the right sequence. Now, that doesn't mean that big bangs are always inappropriate, but typically we see a very carefully calibrated set of waves cut by geography or business unit or combination of the two that enable waves of knowledge to build up in the organization and flow out and build momentum and scale over time. That needs to be really carefully calibrated. Our next podcast is going to be about transformation, and we'll talk more about that as well. But there's also questions about when you bring into your transition additional innovation, additional transformation as well. But in any BPO, there's going to be what we might call day one adaptations, those tweaks that Rakesh, you alluded to there, that are no-brainer changes that need to happen. So all of that needs to be sequenced super carefully at the start.
Yeah, I think that's just to add to that. I think that's a really good point, because generally your BPO provider is going to give you quite an aggressive transition program, and that may not be fit for purpose for you. So it may well be you may want to rip off that plaster quickly and get the job done. But actually, for a lot of companies, I think it ends up being too aggressive for their culture and for their way of working. So I think that's a great point. I think number 5 is back with me. So number 5 for us is really around, more and more, as much as possible, physical knowledge transfer. Now, in these days of COVID and remote working, I think lots of organizations have been forced into doing remote knowledge transfer, and it can work, but it's never as effective as being there in person and really understanding the process and also meeting some of the key stakeholders within the organization. So using that knowledge transfer to be as present as possible and also build that rapport in that culture. So if there is a quick question that one has post go live, that they know the relevant people to ask, and they've met them before and they've developed a rapport, which probably means that they'll get a quicker answer than going through the official channels. So I think as much physical knowledge transfer as possible.
Thanks, Rakesh. So that takes us to number 6, which is on seeding. So it's a technical sounding point here. This is around the seeding or the placement of experienced staff in the delivery team after transition. And this varies by bidder, by scope. And the goal here really is to make sure that you've selected a partner that is going to hand over to experienced teams. Now, many BPO projects and delivery models are built successfully around relatively junior pyramids of teams. But even with those junior pyramids, it's possible and to be expected that there should be people within that who've worked in the process and worked in the industry that is relevant to your work. And the higher that number, the better the chance that there are going to be smarts and a quality of work that is above the average. and you want to really drive that. So, we would typically say at least 25% with that prior industry knowledge, with some smaller, more technical scopes. We've seen that even up to 100%, but at least a minimum of 25 to give you that baseline of industry knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the next one's with me, which is number 7, which is around tools and technology to enable your transition to be more successful. So, I think there are now great tools and tech available, things that will automate the writing of standard operating procedures. So that can be really helpful to accelerate that whole knowledge transfer process, and having technology to update the standard operating procedures. There's tools like task mining and process mining that also provide that detailed knowledge of how the processes work today, and help you identify the level of complexity and risk on those processes. So I'm a great believer, when you're running a BPO transition, to run task mining or process mining beforehand and assess the level of complexity based on how standard or non-standard that process is. Because in too many examples, the training occurs on the happy path, so that actually when you go live, the team are really good on dealing with 50% of the volume, which is on the happy path, but it's the other 50% and all of the other exceptions that are then the challenge, which they were never trained on, don't understand, and have to work out. So yeah, I think having tools and technologies that help you understand exceptions, that help you automate your standard operating procedures, that help you manage your project effectively, are really good tools and technologies to consider as you're going through a BPO transition.
Absolutely, massive point, and that's constantly evolving. It's a really interesting space to watch. So number 8 then is around having what you might call hyperactive comms and service management. Many of the suppliers in the BPO space now, particularly the market leaders, are absolutely world-class service providers. So they have super highly evolved methodologies for running a service, for managing it, for governing it, for putting changes in place, and it's possible to see really the very best in the world at delivering those sorts of activities, running a service to a high degree. Now that doesn't always happen, but you can and should look for that. And I think particularly when it comes to transition, that's really the eye of the storm. It's the highest risk moment in the life of the service, and the supplier needs to be at the top of their game, and you as a buyer, as a user of outsourcing, need to be at the top of your game as well. So you need to be providing, back to the earlier point, the resources and the bandwidth to the team to engage in that governance, to engage in that change management, to understand and to be involved in those service level discussions. So really overacting, hyperactive engagement in all of those service management activities is absolutely vital.
Yeah, very good point. The final one is back with me. Number 9 in our top tips for smooth BPO transitions is around making sure you've got penalties and measures. So, there's a carrot method, there's also a stick method when you're looking at how you run these contracts. And when it comes to penalties, I think you need to be clear. I think it comes back to the point we made earlier around not thinking about transition after you've signed off. You want to think about transition as early as you can, because if there's a delay in transition, if there's an issue identified, it has to be clear who holds that liability and who's going to pay that penalty because of that delay in saving. And if the knowledge transfer hasn't gone well and you need to revisit it, who bears that cost? So I think the cost aspect, the penalties, is a really key one, and it links also to your measure of success. So one of the key questions to ask yourself is, how do you know when the transition has been successful? And the KPIs to measure that success being agreed upon beforehand and potentially contracted against, with penalties, but also maybe incentives to ensure that you're hitting those KPIs and you're hitting those milestones to ultimately help you deliver a fantastic service. So I think penalties and KPIs are probably the final one around transition that I would mention, Paul.
Superb. Thanks, Rakesh. So that ends our whirlwind tour of smooth BPO transitions and our top tips for succeeding in the space. If you've got any questions on what you're hearing, we'd love to talk with you more. Feel free to reach out to us, and we've got plenty more than 20 minutes of ideas on this, but that's our sort of distilled wisdom on this. Massive thanks, Rakesh, for joining us, and
always a pleasure.
Also to our listeners, thank you for your time. As usual, please do subscribe to the podcast wherever you get this from: Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and we've got loads more information on proservartner.co.uk on our ideas and other events. So in the meantime, all the best, and see you next time.
See you next time. Bye, everyone.